Hello, everybody. My name is Maurice Button. I'm the CEO of City and Financial Global, and it's my great pleasure to be interviewing Carlos Santos today. Carlos is a member and chief executive of Ethos Asset Management, and Carlos will be speaking at our Climate Adaptation Summit in London on the 13th of March. Carlos, welcome.
Thank you, Maurice, for the invitation to this conversation today, and it's very nice to be part of this event.
Our pleasure entirely, Carlos. Turning to the first question, while financial institutions are busy working on their net zero plans and their TCFD reporting, etc., do you think that they are as equally focused on the so-called physical risks, i.e. adapting to the extreme weather conditions that we are already experiencing, and which will worsen as we approach 2050 and perhaps beyond?
No, I would tell that is a complex question, right? And pretty much, probably even difficult to give a direct answer about what is really being done on board of these realities, right? One of the things that I believe that is critical to understand is that in the end of the day, it doesn't exist. They ignore the second topic of the reality of what is happening today in terms of these effects, that real, let's tell, environment effects and the impact of them on the operations of the companies today, with what is, that net zero long-term or medium-term goal. Obviously that one and another are peer related, right? Because obviously that as much as you try to achieve a certain level in 2025 and so on the net zero side, right? Obviously that these allow the corporations to try to be immediately effective on what is their approach about these impacts on on the operations on a daily basis. Inclusively, you can see that obviously it's a little different from this reality, but if you go to external effects as for example a COVID reality, or from a war perspective, that obviously they are not ESG issue, but in the end of the day, the effect, I would tell the S of the ESG, the through is these events on today, they oblige the corporations to at least try to understand that something is different today. And the through is, I think that the majority of these medium long-term goals that, the majority of our financial institutions are approaching, they include and they are obviously involved on that events of today and their way to mitigate them on the day of today.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Asset managers like your own organization, Ethos Asset Management, need to understand how investee companies are adapting their operations to cope with fiscal and transition risks. As obviously it makes them attractive investments or not, depending on their responses. Does the wide range of sustainability reporting standards and taxonomies that these investee companies can choose to use, does that make it more difficult to evaluate them? And what could be done to improve that part of this issue?
Right. I would tell you, this is one of the major discussions, right? And in fact, I would tell probably one of the great barriers that you are facing today as a financial institution on the process. In some point, obviously, all the standards or the regulation, and obviously the taxonomy as a regulation as a whole, they are mandatory, right? And obviously that, without that regulation, obviously, no one is aware of this is not an option, but this is mandatory to happen if you want to, make this world and this economy sustainable as a long run, right? Obviously that, regulation and all of that involvement of, external parts on the financial institutions to allow them to do this change as two ways to be seen, right? In some point, it's necessary to oblige to exist that, but at the same time, we know very well that a lot of institutions, they try to avoid, and in fact, they do not do what they should do. But what I think that is important to see, Maurice, is I don't see the financial institutions so bad behave as the academic world is trying to pass. It's obviously that we have, terrible experience with clear financial institutions that they manipulate data. They tell that, they are doing a lot of wonderful, impact in ESG projects. But when you really go through the process, you see, They didn't reduce the fossil fuels investments. They didn't change even their board of directors that half of them belongs to ex Shell and BP corporations. But the truth is, exists a general understanding that if the corporations want to exist on the long run, they need to be sustainable. Now, how can this sustainability happen? And I think that this is where we need that the academy world, the governance, and obviously the financial institutions, these three parties sit on the same table and align their goals. Because, like I told, let's go to our example now. We are totally okay with this investment, even understanding that, obviously my cash flow on the short term will be small. Why? Because I have more investment to be to fulfill the metrics. I need to have, in the end of the day, a less profitable investment in some point in time. But the truth is, if I realize and if I'm able to look to the project on a long run and understand that if I do not enter with the SG policies on my decision making process, my investment is profitable in the short term but disappear because we are not there tomorrow. If this start to be seen as a need to exist as a long run corporation, all the CEOs will accept it. A lot of times too, one of the things that is important to understand is the decision makers inside of asset management companies or banks or investment firms, they don't decide against ESG because they want that the world is destroyed. In the end of the day, and this is where I think, and you touch on the point about evaluation process. One of the most difficult things that we investment firms face is how to measure the externalities, right? How can I know what is the positive and negative externality? Because when I receive, the evaluation of a project, I look to the numbers and I tell what, looking to this and let's tell preconditions and externalities, I think that this is a good or a bad investment. And sometimes, this doesn't mean that we are doing properly, but it means that the data that we are being behind the decision maker is wrong. And I think that again, this is where we need the academic world to help us to, how can I measure correctly the externalities? Because if I'm able to do it, my decision making process will be better. Understand too, that when you go to the regulation side, obviously that two types of regulations are mandatory in this process. One is the taxation. Obviously we know very well that taxation has the effect as a Laffer curve on the corporations. Too high taxation, we know that corporations try to avoid, but up to a certain level, everybody is okay to pay. That means in the ESG, nothing means that needs to be different. If you understand that respect may have, even if it doesn't have a direct financial benefit on the short term in terms of cash flow, this doesn't mean that in market value you are not positive affected. In fact, we have studies, we have internal analyses that show that we can face, I know that is not empirical proven as a whole academy, but you have examples that more ESG has a positive effect and significant effect on the performance of the company. And if you can show this to corporations, this is a game changer. Another thing that can be very interesting is you need that the accounting regulation is adjusted on the moment to do, how can I recognize all that positive and negative externalities effect on my financials? Because one of the things that doesn't happen today is you want to convince the boards, you want to convince the financial institutions to change, but in the end of the day, they do not know even how to do it internally, right? And that is obviously affecting because they prefer delay taking action to see what will happen on the market and how all of this reality will be changed. In a summary, and to don't consume too much time on this question, the point is, I think that, again, I think that a lot of things are being done properly. We see, beautiful investments across the world in emerging markets inclusively, that ESG is being respected by the financial institutions. Nevertheless, I think that a long path needs to be done on taxation side, accounting regulation, and obviously this is a major issue, is capacity to measure positive and negative externalities. And this is where I tell we need to be aligned with the academic world that it's looking to the investment firms as the bad boys on this table, but in the end of the day, it is not that.
Yeah, understand. In that context, Carlos, What do you think are the principal challenges that financial institutions face when using scenario planning and modeling in their climate adaptation planning?
That goes pretty much on one of the points that I just mentioned, right? I mean,
Mhm.
when you look to example of how can I really measure this negative externality of do a
Yeah,
bridge or for example do a port. I have a very interesting example that we have investment in Africa in Mozambique, in the north of Mozambique. We are financing a $400 million port, right? Will be one of the biggest port in all that side of Africa. And obviously when you start to look to the social impact of the port, it is massive. You affect more than 200 million population. 5 countries are directly benefit. You're talking about new hospitals, new schools, new housing in the place that today you have war. The social impact and the externality, the positive externality on the social side is absolutely amazing. You are bringing a channel of communication in the world in a place that clouds doesn't go. Even the simple fuel to a car or to a train doesn't exist, and that can be a game changer in all that social side. Obviously, you cannot ignore that. You're talking about an area of Africa that you have coal production, and obviously it's very difficult to develop a port and tell what you are not allowed to export coal here, when obviously the financial interests around are governmental and they will want to use the port for that. And when you look to a port like that, you see that 20%, 15% of the future revenues can depend of what is not really environmental, let's say, amicable, right? But
yeah,
in that moment, what makes us move with investment like that? When we're looking to the modelization, we saw positive externalities of the social on the top level, and this effect for 3.5% of our decision. On the environmental side, obviously, we have another 3.5% that will influence our decision. On that side of that point perspective, on the coal exportation, obviously is a disaster. But on the other side, we are revitalizing significant part of the region because we need to put some trees, even be sustainable on the construction of the new hospitals, new schools. That means when you are analyzing, on the ESG as the whole, as governance, social, and environment, we are
yeah,
positive. Okay, this means that we are fully positive? No, this means that the positive externalities are higher than the negative externalities. Now, should we stop all the investments like that? And now this is where Maurice, I think that we need to try to understand what is really the goal, right? And where should we be? Obviously, that this was 7 years ago that started. In that moment, our decision was yes, we need to move forward because I cannot talk about the environment in the area of the globe that people are suffering to survive today, and they don't have a food, they don't have nothing. And again, I'm not telling that in that case we can destroy the environment. I'm telling that you have ways to balance it. Nevertheless, if that is not the goal as a whole economy, in that case we need to align regulatory institutions to tell what, I need to be financially able as a regulatory institution to create a mechanism that if this investment doesn't happen, that society can be substituted in such a way that this is not necessary. And this
yeah,
is where I think that modelization of positive and negative externalities, we need to have better ways to measure because probably the negative externality is much higher than you can imagine. And and I gave this example of the port, but I can give you example of an airport in Europe a couple of years ago that walk away because the effect of creating the airport in that place will affect a couple of migratory channels for birds and all the environment around that. We told what, it is financial, a very profitable project, but if you went through it, the negative externalities that the environment is being affected, this is not profitable. We are out. And the project never moved forward. And we were not the unique telling that, other investors did the same. This is to tell you what, again, I think that one of the major keys here is exactly that capacity to know how can we measure. And to tell you the truth, I think that is not only on the side of the investment side that people don't really know how to do it. I think that on the project promoter side, on the developers, you continue to have a lot of, I would tell, challenges to know how to really measure that. And unfortunately, you start to see, a couple of people, telling me, all the world now is expert in ESG, but in fact, it is not like that, right? And this is what I was telling, a couple of months ago. I was in Oxford Summit about, exactly this same issue, and I was telling that, listen, it's not that we want to do wrong. It's we need help to know how can I measure correctly to when the paper come to my table, I take the right decision. And again, this is where, if you tell me, because one of the great arguments is a lot of the academy believes that no matter what, you will not be able to prove the performance being affected positively because of ESG. And I believe that you can, but let's assume that we cannot. This doesn't mean that investors are not able to support that cost. What is important is, again, the academy and the government, it's able to explain, what, you will lose money with that, but why should we lose money because of that? Because if we understand that, if we are able to go to my board and tell, what, we need to do this because this is what make us exist on the long run, everybody understand that reality of sustainability. Because remember, sustainability is not an ESG concept. 20 years ago, people were talking about sustainability in a corporation, and that is exactly the same definition, right? This is why I think that, one of these biggest keys is that capacity to measure, what tools can the corporations have to measure the externalities, positive and negative, and at the same time, even if the negative are higher than the positive or vice versa, if the regulation does not want that we do it, in that case, we need that regulation on the table, clearly defined.
It's certainly a complex area, and I think the individual elements of the E, S, and G can make investment decisions very, very difficult. But Carlos, I think we've run out of time, so thank you very much indeed for some very interesting answers to those questions. And I very much look forward to meeting you and hearing your further views on this subject at the Climate Adaptation Summit in Central London on the 30th of March. And I very much hope that our viewers will be able to join us in person as well. So Carlos, just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you, Maurice. It was my pleasure.